Hi everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Overeducated, Underloved Millennials. My name is Adam Stokes, and as always, I'm joined by my brilliant co-host Katie Ward. Hi
Hi,
Katie, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. I think it's a case of trying to keep up with everything in the last week. It's just oh,
It's been a bit mental, isn't it? I was going to
it
say I'm
has.
a bit tired.
It's
I'm a
it's
bit
been
tired,
such a
but I haven't really been overly busy. And then I was like, it's because of the week that we.
it's been mental. So it goes without saying this week we will be covering just the insanity that has been British politics for the last sort of week. The loss of one chancellor, the appointment of a new chancellor, the then complete abandonment of so-called Trussonomics, and what we might now see as an alternative conservative economic policy. And yeah, just a whole bunch of chaos around that. We're going to talk about the possibility of a return of a familiar face from the past, Boris Johnson, as that's been sort of hinted at the last couple of days. So we'll definitely talk about that as well towards the end of the section on UK politics. And we're also going to talk about the US a bit as well. We're going to talk about the fact that President Trump has been subpoenaed, which Katie knows far more about than I do. And we're going to talk about, in relation to that, we're going to talk about January 6th and, the events that occurred. And the fact that it's been a year and a half since that happened, I mean, that just sort of blows my mind. So looking ahead, so starting off, I guess we have to go back to Thursday, right? So on Thursday, Kwasi Kwarteng flies to
We
the
have
US.
Sorry.
To go back, basically we just have to go through the entire week. It's been that crazy. So on Thursday, Kwasi Kwarteng flies to the US to have a meeting with the IMF, effectively to try and calm the markets, right? So this mini budget, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, effectively spooked the markets, and effectively the last 2 weeks, I think it's fair to say, there's just been constant backlash, constant criticisms from Tory MPs, from obviously from the opposition as well. So yeah, so he went to the US effectively to try and do a bit of damage control, to try and fix things. And most importantly, of course, on Thursday evening, I think it was, the BBC released an interview with him in which he said, and I quote, "I am not going anywhere." So of course, the very next day, on Friday morning, you suddenly hear sort of Sky News and the BBC reporting that all of a sudden Kwasi Kwarteng's trip to the US has been cut short, and he's flying home. And you have these brilliant I don't know who the people who do this, but people were tracking his plane to
You
try
can
and
do it
work out.
yourself. Have you never
I
done
don't.
it?
No, I've not. Clearly, I'm not. Clearly, I'm
You
not
can do it
that savvy
online.
enough. But like,
Yeah, you could do it online. You could get on Flight Tracker and you could track all of these important flights. And loads of people were using it like a sort of swipe at him, like, oh, not as many people tracked his flight as tracked the Queen's flight. And you're like, yeah, because no one likes him.
that's
Like,
so. Yeah, but it was such a. And also there was the fact that people were emphasizing the fact that it was the last plane out on that night, so it was clearly there was a lot of drama around it. And very shortly after, before he touched down, really, the BBC and Sky were both reporting these rumours. I think they came from the Times or the Telegraph originally, that he was going to be sacked, that Liz Truss was going to invite him to number 10 and effectively give him the axe. So yeah, so as we saw, he was then so after these rumours sort of swirled, he landed. He then went to back to Downing Street, went to number 10 Downing Street, and very quickly, I think sort of by midday, the BBC and Sky were both reporting it was done. He'd been sacked. So I guess first of all, Katie, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on that whole saga before we get onto the replacement?
so as if it wasn't embarrassing enough that we had to send our Chancellor to the IMF on emergency business to basically go and put out all of the fires that we had started. Not we, because we didn't vote for her. But anyway, our government had started. So then have him sort of like pulled back like a naughty schoolboy by the headmistress to go and be told off. I think it was a very weird day, Friday. And I seem to remember, when you said it was a very short period, it was 10 minutes because me and my friend were studying at the same table and we had the live feed going. And he walked in, and 10 minutes later, BBC was like, it's done. And so it was very sudden. Um, I think my main thing that tried to ask myself when I saw it was, is it worth it? Because we know why she's done it, right? So one of the reasons, well, the main reason why she's done it is she wants to be able to palm off all of this bad stuff that has happened onto Kwasi Kwarteng and say he was the Chancellor, he made the decisions here regarding the economic policy. I simply supported him, you know, and sort of played to the line that he told me, but it was all him. He did it. And the only problem is when you're Liz Truss and using all of the analysis that we've done previously, where you can only parrot the party line and you say things over and over and over and over and over again, she has put herself completely with the economic policy. She actually said it was her and Kwasi's idea and kept repeating it. So I think she thought, okay, we'll get rid of him and then like everybody will give me like a fresh start. And as I'm sure that you'll agree, that's not what's happened. What do you think of it all?
I think like my first response would be simply, well, she's just thrown him under the bus. I mean, very clearly, the last 2 weeks have been hell. The polls have just got worse and worse. The criticisms from across the spectrum, from left to right, have just got worse and worse. And I think, you know, it got to a point where she's become so desperate that she's decided to throw someone who, by the way, and this is the thing, right? It shows how much loyalty there is in politics when Kwasi Kwarteng is supposedly Liz Truss's very close friend, very close ally, and she basically just took the decision, well, I need to save my skin, so I've got to chuck someone under the bus. So Kwasi Kwarteng, it has to be you. And I'm not surprised by that at all, but I think it just, you know, again shows the lack of loyalty Liz Truss has. And also, I think I would also say, when we talk about, you know, the U-turns, I think it just sort of shows the lack of principle she has. And we talked about this before, the fact that she seems to be able to change her position with the wind whenever it suits her. You get that sort of sense again. And yeah, so I think it just sort of, it clearly isn't a good look, particularly, of course, as he was only in the job for a month, particularly as, you know, sort of just a couple of days before, her and other cabinet ministers were sort of saying, this is the plan, we're going to continue going with the plan. Kwasi Kwarteng's our guy, Liz Truss is our, you know, our PM, hooray. Sort of, you know, they were really, you know, this. So yeah, I think what you said is right, and I think it just, you know, stinks, to be frank. It just makes her look terrible. It makes, frankly, British politics look like a bit of a joke as well, if I'm being honest.
It makes the Conservatives look terrible as well. Like let's not. So the polls are only sort of. So the polls tell you in the UK. So it's not very much. I'm very conscious of lining this out against the US, because obviously in the US you have two different types of polling, where it's against like your president and then against the party itself, you know, in like the Senate and the House. So in the UK, it's all grouped into one poll called Westminster voting intention, really. We do have different polls where it says how good do you think the Prime Minister is, etc. But the Westminster voting intention is, if there was a general election tomorrow, how would you vote? And we have seen it creeping up since Liz Truss came in. It's crept up from 30% to 40% to 50% to Labour. And the Conservatives, on the most recent projection, would only have something like 22 seats. So they wouldn't even be the second largest party. We're talking about total Conservative obliteration. So what we've got here is we've got not only Liz Truss, we've got the British public turning against the Conservatives as a whole, because they're like, well, who are you? Who are you letting this person govern? Basically, you're letting this person who is totally unfit for office govern us, and it's not okay. So I think it's really important to kind of tease out the strings of how the British public is reacting, and really the damage that Liz Truss is not only doing to the British economy and British politics, but also to the Conservative Party as well as an institution. Like, if there was a general election tomorrow, it would be completely destroyed.
Yeah, I must admit, the idea of Ed Davey being leader of the opposition does bring a smile to my face. Though I think, you know,
I smiled as well. When I saw it, I was like, yeah, I could work with that.
Yeah, so Ed Davey, leader of the opposition, has a quite nice ring to it, though. You know, let's not get ahead of ourselves. So let's move on to the replacement. So it was very quickly afterwards, actually, she announced Jeremy Hunt would be the new Chancellor. And just so for younger viewers might not have heard of Jeremy Hunt or know him as well, I think it's important to look at who Jeremy Hunt is as a person and where he's come from.
Lucky you. You're good. Lucky you.
I think it's fair to say he was definitely, I think, during the coalition government, probably in the sort of top 5 most influential ministers. If you sort of David Cameron, George Osborne, I'll include Nick Clegg to be nice, Michael Gove, and probably him as well. They were sort of the big of the coalition, possibly, you know, Theresa May as well, maybe. So he started off as his first ministerial job was between 2010 and 2012. He was head of the department for media and sports. which doesn't sound like a big role, but actually in that point it was very important because of the Olympics in 2012. So he was that was a big thing. He was, big on. And then sort of, I guess, his reward from David Cameron for sort of helping, which was in fairness a relatively successful Olympics, was then to become
the only thing that I would give them credit for. It did go very well.
yeah. So then he moves. So he moves to the Department of Health in 2012, and it's fair to say he was, let's say, a divisive figure in the Department of Health. I think it's fair to say he was extremely unpopular with NHS staff for many of the restructurings he sort of put through on the NHS. He was very unpopular with junior doctors. There was, of course, a famous junior doctor strike sort of during the coalition period. And I mean, also that also raises the point of, effectively this guarantees nurses will probably strike again, because clearly they'll see this news and they'll just be like, oh God, and that will almost definitely, any of the sort of like the 10% who were considering not voting for strike have now probably changed their ballot immediately. So he did that role up until 2018. So he did actually have that role for the sort of 2 years under Theresa May as well. So he was very much, I think that sort of shows that he was he's sort of, he was respected by that sort of conservative establishment at that point. And then he spent 1 year between 2018 and 2019 as the Foreign Secretary. And, to be honest, it was 1 year, and I think the only thing most people remember really was the gaffe when he accidentally said to one of the trip to Beijing that his Chinese wife was Japanese, which was a bit of a tongue. I guess, you call it a Freudian slip. I mean, in his defense, he does speak fluent Japanese, so maybe that's why he got a bit confused. But yeah, I think so. Yeah, so like the point is, he was a very experienced minister for this sort of 9-year period. And then, of course, for those who know your very recent political history, in 2019, Theresa May loses power, and there's a leadership election in which Jeremy Hunt stands, and he stands against Boris Johnson. And in this leadership contest, he ends up finishing in the final two with Boris Johnson. So him and Boris Johnson then obviously go to the members, and Boris Johnson absolutely sort of smashes him. And, Johnson wins quite easily, and Jeremy Hunt is then sort of, well, basically put into the sort of political abyss, right? He clearly wasn't really him and Johnson weren't friends. They clearly, were very different parts of the Conservative Party. So he was effectively, his 9 years of sort of influence were sort of, he was kicked into the long grass effectively. Though he was, I believe, head of the Select Committee for Health during the COVID period, so he was still sort of around. Yeah, and then he did then try again in 2022 to stand for the leadership, but much worse this time. He ended up coming sort of dead last, effectively. And
as Staff said yesterday, he came 8 of 8.
Yes, exactly. So no, I think there was that one. No, I think there was a night fella, wasn't there? A guy who no one had heard of who stood. So I think he didn't technically come last if you include that guy. I feel really bad because I've forgotten his name, but yeah. Yeah, so that was just a sort of very brief sort of introduction to Jeremy Hunt. And so effectively what Jeremy Hunt has done is, actually, I guess the starting point would be, so why has Liz Truss picked Jeremy Hunt? I think she's effectively picked Jeremy Hunt, from what I gather, because he is effectively the total opposite of Kwasi Kwarteng. He effectively, his economic approach is very much that traditional conservative approach of, we must tighten our belts, we must be fiscally, really sort of traditional conservative idea of being really fiscally responsible. And I think effectively she's picked someone like that because she wants to try and calm the markets down. The markets have been spooked the last 2 weeks by the sort of chaos of this attempt, this sort of economic experiment by Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. So she's effectively picked someone who will be something of a safe bet, I think, is what she's banking on. She's banking on hopefully him creating some degree of economic stability, in which will then save her job. So, Katie, over to you. I've realized that was a very long monologue from me. I apologise.
No,
so, over to you. What are your thoughts on Jeremy Hunt in general before we start talking about actual politics?
Jeremy Hunt in general, as a Labourite, I'm sure you can imagine, I am not favourable towards Jeremy Hunt. I don't believe in restructuring the National Health Service in a way that he did. I don't believe in cutting various parts of the National Health Service. There's only one word that I think of when I think of Jeremy Hunt, and it is austerity. And well, that's one nice word. But I can't say those words on the podcast, as I've already been told. But anyway, I think of austerity, I think of strikes, I think of the general tough times that were had at the start of the Conservative government and throughout the Conservative government, when we're looking at cutting, when we're looking at drawing back of services, etc. Really, I blame Jeremy Hunt for the situation that the NHS is in now, where people are having to wait 6 hours for ambulances, etc. All of the groundwork was laid out by Jeremy Hunt. So yeah, I don't view him as a safe pair of hands, but I can understand why the Conservative voter base would, because one of the things that you have to always remind yourself, obviously, as a Labourite and a Liberal, is that they really thought austerity was great, and they still do. They think that the country has, you know, bounced back because of austerity. Well, has bounced back, did bounce back because of austerity. So they're big sort of flag flyers of it. So they find it good. I think it is really interesting with Jeremy Hunt. I think there's two things that we need to look at here when it comes to motivations behind putting him in the role. I think we need to look at what the motivation is with the markets. Liz Truss, I think, with this move, and whoever's helped her, because at this point I really don't think she's making decisions on her own, but this has been a move to save the markets before the party, which is important because it shows that they realise that they've lost both at this moment in time. And to get the party back, they believe they must get the markets under control, and they believe that they must sort out the economic mess that they have created. And I'm saying that they have created because Liz Truss actually went on television a couple of days ago and said sorry, and basically said we went too hard, too fast, and now Jeremy Hunt's here to sort it out. So that's the narrative. The other thing that we need to look at as well is the political motivation. Okay, so we've spoken about how Jeremy Hunt's a safe pair of hands, how, you know, to the Conservative base, he's a bit, but they don't hate him. Even though they didn't put him as leader, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like him. So he is more of a traditional Conservative. So we need to look at it from a political perspective where what's the next move, right? And I think that this is a concerted effort to try and find what the Conservatives and what the press are calling a unity candidate, a candidate that can bring both sides of the Conservative Party, your Johnson fans, your Sunak fans, you know, both sides, and get them to sit down at a table and agree over a candidate to run against Keir Starmer. Because I think every Conservative has admitted now it's definitely not going to be Liz Truss. So I think this is a step towards getting rid of Liz Truss as well.
I think that's definitely the case, and we will talk about the future of Liz Truss in a bit. But I think
the very short future.
Clearly from Truss's perspective, obviously, I think part of the political motivation might have been to try and appease the sort of the people who've been causing trouble. So your Michael Goves, your Grant Shapps, those sorts of people. Though clearly, as we've seen and we will discuss in the last couple of days, that clearly hasn't worked very well. So I think that was part of it as well. So let's talk about effectively what he's doing now he's in. So over the weekend, he did a sort of media press sort of gauntlet around Sky, the BBC, did the whole shebang, went on the Laura Kuenssberg show, you know, the whole weekend. But basically, I think every the whole weekend gauntlet basically of the mainstream media. And he
went on Radio 4 with Miriam Margolyes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So he effectively. And this weekend, basically, what he did was he basically he prepared people. He set the groundwork. He basically said, "I'm going to have to reverse a lot of what this mini budget did because, as we've discussed, there was lots of really terrible, stupid stuff in it, which made no economic sense." And again, the fact that that's united me, you, and most of the Conservative Party shows just how insane it was. I mean,
we agreed with Jeremy Hunt.
Exactly. It's just so he obviously that was a big message that he was sending. And also another message was and we will again talk about this as well after we talked about U-turns, he was preparing people for spending cuts. And he was preparing people basically saying, because of the economic mess we are now in, we're going to have to tighten our belts. So following on from that, he then made a statement on Monday, sort of effectively laying out some of these plans. And effectively, as the video today is called, U-turning Tories, effectively most of the mini budget is now gone. I think so. The plan to freeze corporation tax has been reversed. It will now be increased. The cut of the basic rate of income tax by 1p has been reversed. The energy bills policy, which Liz Truss, that was the bit of a crazy thing. So Liz, part of the mini budget was the fact that Liz Truss said we will freeze energy bills for 2 years, and she said, "Aha, Labour, aha, Liberal Democrats, you only wanted to do it until April. We've got you there. We've outdone you." But the problem, of course, now is that Jeremy Hunt has now U-turned that and effectively is now copying the Labour, the Dem proposal. so they will not only be freeze until April. So that entire sort of her
it's becoming, what is it, deja vu I'm getting, because it seems like every policy that we come out with, the Conservatives are, oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, but this is even worse because she tried to sort of outdo it. She tried to be better, and now she's having to go back on it because it was just completely economically irresponsible.
It's like Keir Starmer, where they were like, do you, in Prime Minister's Question Time, do you not like the energy cap? Do you not like the energy cap? And Keir Starmer was like, yes, but I don't think you should do it this way. Like, it's got to the point where, like, you're watching it and you're like, what are you saying? Sorry, anyway, go on, carry on.
So basically the mini budget was butchered. I mean, it was effectively taken to the back of the Downing Street Garden and shot in the back of the head, effectively. I mean, the only things left, they're still going to reverse the national insurance increase. That's still happening, and they're still going to remove the cap on bankers' bonuses, which we talked about before. I think is, well, I mean, there's a sort of left-wing argument that it's morally wrong. I think there's also, as I talked about, a centrist argument about how it's irresponsible for markets and for the banking industry and sector. And then the third thing was, what was the third thing? Oh yes, the cut on stamp duty, which the Conservative argument is that it will encourage young people to buy homes. Though, of course, as Tim Farron brilliantly put it in the House of Commons, all it'll do is it'll just encourage people, wealthier people, to buy second homes in places like Cumbria, where Tim Farron is, or Wales, or Cornwall, or possibly build up, property in London. So really, this, the Conservatives are trying to say that this will, help boost home ownership. It won't. It'll just help people who are rich buy second homes and maybe a nice holiday home for themselves, because they've definitely earned it.
And you know what we've always said, Adam? We've always said that at this time of year, in this economy, the landlords really need a helping hand. Jesus.
I mean, to the idea that you could go from having a house that costs 500 grand to 300 grand, and suddenly a young person on 20 grand a year can suddenly afford that, is obviously just for the birds. So yeah, so really. But yeah, so the fundamental point is that effectively, Truss's big, bold economic plan is effectively dead. I mean, it seems we've now gone back to, I guess, what you'd call a traditional conservative economic approach. So moving on to that, of course, that means as part of that, spending cuts. And Jeremy Hunt has said he'll be asking all departments to look at possible places for where efficiencies can be made. Though somebody. I get it's a very fair point to say that, given the cuts that have been made previously, it will be very difficult to see where departments can make efficiencies. Two areas which seem to be particularly in sort of actually, there's three sort of big ones that have been rumoured, and I emphasise the fact these are rumours, not actually confirmed things yet. The first one is health, and again, we talked about Jeremy Hunt and health and his view on nurses, and clearly maybe he just takes the view they hate me already, so I might as well just stick the knife in. Maybe that's it. The second one is actually defence. Now, of course, the problem with that is that and we talked about this as well, during the leadership campaign, Liz Truss promised by 2026 it would be 2.5% of GDP, which apparently has been, I think that's now been officially scrapped. And then it would be 3% by 2030. And this is something which the Defence Secretary Wallace, I can't remember his first name.
Ben,
thank you, Ben Wallace. That was it. Thank you. He clearly, this was a big thing he supported, and I think he actually wanted it to be 4%. So I think if they do cut defence spending, which is looking possible and likely, he might be a resignation that we see quite soon. I think that wouldn't be much of a surprise, which I think would clearly look terrible given the fact that there's been a strong emphasis on how much he's helped Ukraine. There's been a strong emphasis on, effectively everyone in the Tory party seems to think he's the only sort of good person left who hasn't been sort of tainted by all of the Tory chaos. So if they lose him, then they would be in trouble. And the final one, which I must admit I don't think will happen, is the triple lock on pensions. So the triple lock on pensions is effectively a commitment from the government that pensions will always increase, either with inflation at a minimum of, I think it's 2%, or what was the third? I can't remember what the other one is. Savings, or so basically it's a protection on pensions to keep them up with prices and make sure pensioners don't have a real cut to their income. And to be honest, regardless of what you think about that would just be political suicide, right? Because everyone remembers in 2017 Theresa May had what was called effectively it was nicknamed the dementia tax by the media, which was this idea that older people should have to sell off their homes to pay for their social care. And that went down terribly, and it effectively, I think you could argue, was the policy that derailed the 2017 election for the Tories. So this idea of effectively, but basically, the media would portray it as an attack on the elderly. It would be political stupidity and electorally just suicidal, in my opinion.
I mean, let's unpack that, obviously, for our international viewers. So we have, in the UK, we have a large demographic. Everybody looks, when you look at politics, you look at it from demographics, you look at it from, various different approaches. And one of the demographics that is typical to split votes in the United Kingdom is by age. So in the United Kingdom, typically, if you are younger, you vote Labour Liberal. If you are older, you vote Conservative Liberal, right? So the Liberals kind of get a nice little broad sort of wash. I don't know whether you would agree. You do have more younger members, and I would say sort of middle-aged members than really old members. But I think that's just the age of the party, in my opinion. Labour tend to have, and this is not saying that Labour don't have older voters. I mean, my grandparents, who, coal miners, would rather die than vote Conservative. But it's with age comes money, comes more of an idea of being fiscally more responsible, more socially conservative, and that's sort of how we look at demographics in the UK, really. So the Conservatives have a large elderly voter base. They live in more rural areas, etc., and they look to the Conservatives to provide a fiscally responsible time for them to be in their retirement, right? Basically, safe pair of hands for us to be in our retirement. Getting rid of this triple lock on pensions, as Adam said, basically alienates most of their voter base, which at a time where you are this far behind in the polls, where I would argue the only people that are voting for you are that voter base, because that's how you'd get those 22 seats, because I've looked at where they are in the country and there ain't a lot of young people knocking around those areas, I'd say. So I think that it's not only electoral suicide, it's electoral suicide at the completely wrong time, where they need to be trying to consolidate that base so that they can say, right, we've got them, let's move on, to get more votes to maintain their seat count. So it's stupid, right? So yeah, health, let's talk about health. I understand and I agree with what you're saying, where he's like, the nurses and doctors already hate me, so I might as well just go whole hog. The only issue is, what we're seeing now is with the strike action, the public in the UK, it's not like the 80s. They are very, very, very supportive of strike action that is happening at the moment. We've got something like 70-80% of people supporting the rail workers' strikes. People like myself who have to use the trains, looking to see what days they strike. So I'm not a scab and I don't use the railways. And I know loads of people that are doing that because I live in rural Norfolk and Suffolk area. So people are just looking and working around it, and people will do exactly the same with the NHS. They've already started saying, if the nurses go on strike, fully support them because they carried us through COVID. So the national narrative is not for further cuts in the health service. We have horror stories. A friend of mine called an ambulance in Norwich the other day. 10 hours it took for the ambulance to come. 10 hours. Ridiculous. The person, so we've got doctors and nurses. I know people that work in the NHS, obviously I'm not going to name them, that basically are saying, for goodness sake, this Christmas do not have a heart attack. Don't have one, because you will die. So to start messing with the NHS again at this time, I think is electoral suicide, because there's one thing that does bridge most political arguments in the United Kingdom, which it doesn't in the US. It's a European thing, really. You do not touch the National Health Service. Universal healthcare for all, free at the point of care. That's what it needs to be, right? So that's going to be really unpopular. Defence. Now, I can speak about this with a little bit and I'm an armed forces spouse, so I can speak about that. I'm sitting in an armed forces house at the moment. I can speak a little bit to this, onto the extent of traditional voter bases. Again, at this time, in a foreign policy perspective, we've got Russia kicking off with Ukraine, Russia threatening nuclear, the use of nuclear weapons. we need a strong defence system. Now, I'm not here as a socialist saying let's just chuck all our money to defence and have a military industrial complex like America. No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is we do need a strong and convincing defence to be able to assist the Ukrainians, to be able to do exactly what you said, Adam, carry on the good work that Ben Wallace has been doing. And I will praise him for this, because me and my partner have both been very impressed with all of the stuff that he's been doing, because he's been very, very good and very, very supportive. And the programmes that we've got to help Ukraine at the moment are great, and they are within our means, right? So to cut money from defence as well at the moment is also alienating a traditional voter base, because people in the military do also traditionally vote more Conservative. So all of the things that they're looking at doing and cutting and messing with have the potential to further alienate them from the voter bases that they need to win the next general election. So I don't understand at this time of national narrative how they are going to justify it and how they are going to spin it so that it seems to be the responsible thing to do. Because in my opinion, I don't know whether you share this opinion, in my opinion, that ship has sailed.
So I think, I'm just trying to think how the question of how they would justify it, because obviously that's important, right? I think how they will try to spin it is very similar to what they did in 2010, where they'll say there's a huge the UK finances are in significant trouble and we need to tighten our belts. The only difference, of course, this time, and I think that this actually, I was going to ask this question, is this, because effectively this would be a return to austerity. And I had a question written down, could the Tories spin austerity again? And could they persuade people it's the right thing to do? And this time, I just don't think they could, for two reasons. Firstly, the public has gotten used to a larger government which spends more. And whether or not you agree with that or not, the fact is that's where the electorate are at now, particularly because of COVID, and also this big help with energy bills as well. So if you suddenly say, all right, we're going to go from hot to cold, we're going to suddenly turn the shower to freezing cold, and we're suddenly going to cut back quite rapidly in some places, that's not going to that just won't fly with the electorate. They just won't accept it. And I think the fact that the polls haven't shifted shows that they're not going to accept it. I think that the second way they might try and justify it. The second reason why it won't work, this justification, I think, will be partly because in 2010, the argument was, look, we've come in and we weren't in charge before. It was the Labour Party. It was also the global. They didn't really talk about the global financial crisis, but it was also, they could also say that there was a global financial crisis. The Labour Party, Gordon Brown, they messed up the economy. There was no
financial crisis. It was all Gordon Brown, Adam.
Yeah, there was a note from a Treasury officer which said, we've got no money left.
The money's all gone.
Yeah, exactly. So, and whether or not you agree with that or not, that clearly worked, right? Because they won in 2015. So but of course, the obvious reason why that won't work this time is because these guys have been in power for 12 years, right? So you can't really say, well, we're in this economic mess, we need to fix it, and it's, oh wait, whose fault is it? Oh god, it's our fault. That's the problem. I mean, I guess how they would spin it is, as they have been doing, blame the global crisis, blame the issues in Ukraine, which I think to some extent, I think they obviously do play a role, but I think very clearly, I think what my point is that clearly these are very different times to 2010, and I don't think it'll wash this time.
I agree, and I think it's largely due to the national narrative changing. I think that, why do I think that that's happening? First of all, I mean, we could have a whole episode on this, which is very apt, because I do think it is demographic and generational. I do think what we're seeing now is boomers are getting to the age now where they are sadly starting to pass away. So the boomer demographic is no longer the largest in the United Kingdom. The young people are the largest demographic in the United Kingdom at the moment. Millennials and Gen Z, now that Gen Z have started voting, have a larger voting sway than boomers. And what's been very good with the advent of, I would say as well, TikTok and certain pieces of social media, is it has actually increased political engagement. I would say it can be in a positive and a negative way, because the far right do also use it. But I do think that the national narrative is changing with the age of the populace that are obviously moving into. And I think that the Conservatives with this austerity are showing that they're not keeping up with that. We want a big government. I think majority of people our age want a government that is competent. You obviously don't want as big a government as I want because, you know, political ideology. But I think that young people expect a certain level of competency, of services and of support. And also, one of the things that we've been talking about recently, value for money from the government. If I don't mind paying taxes, and I know that most young people don't mind paying taxes, but there's the golden but. I want my taxes to go towards something better. I want my taxes to go towards supporting my local community, towards supporting the National Health Service, towards supporting those who are unable to work. I want to see where my taxes are going and doing good, right? So I think that there's this sort of generational shift that is happening in politics, which the Conservatives are finding it very, very hard to keep up with. And I think that this austerity is a really good example of that, how they have not been able to keep up with the national narrative. And then on the other side, because you've got to think, on the other side of the coin, Keir Starmer is basically offering this really, really great notion to people that aren't necessarily millennials and Gen Z, but who are our parents, who are like the younger boomers, kind of saying, well, don't you want your kids to do well? Look at what they're doing to your kids. Your kids can't buy houses, your kids. And it's really, really good because it's appealing to the narrative of, look, if you don't want to vote for you, vote for your kids. And it's just, and then you've got austerity against that. How are you going to level those two ideologies in an election? And how are you going to make people pick austerity over, you know, growth and support? I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's definitely, it feels like they're effectively trying to rehash the arguments from 2010, 2015, when the world has moved on. It feels like we have moved on from that point.
Take the horrible medicine, it's good for you. And you're like, no, we've been down this road before. It did nothing.
Yeah, I think, it's, so yeah, so I think, because I'm trying to keep an eye on time, I do really want to talk about Trump as well. So let's quickly talk about the future of Liz Truss. So, actually, no, sorry. So yeah, I guess as part of that, there's obviously this narrative currently going around is that Liz Truss is now the Prime Minister in name only. Effectively, Jeremy Hunt has.
And Ma put it very well. She sits where the Prime Minister should sit. She stands on the piece of carpet that the Prime Minister should stand on. She attends the briefings that the Prime Minister should attend, but it is all in person only.
No, absolutely. I think he put it perfectly. Yeah, so effectively, the narrative now, and even whether it's true or not, the fact that this has now become an almost accepted, established narrative that Jeremy Hunt is now the acting Prime Minister, which, fair play to him, he found a way to get there eventually after losing 2 leadership elections. So you've got to give him credit.
He's found another way of putting an unelected leader in a position of power. Well done.
He had tenacity and kept going, and in the end, he got what he wanted. So I guess fair play to him. But yeah, so this clearly, just completely undermines her I get it, further undermines her. I mean, how many times have we said she's been undermined in the last month? I mean, it just seems to happen every week now, every day, in fact. So yeah, so clearly she's in a very undermined position because of that, and the Tories have started to turn, right? So yesterday, just to give you an example, the MP for Guildford, I believe Angela Richardson, I think her name is, she said this yesterday morning that it felt like Liz Truss would have to go if things didn't get better. Michael Gove yesterday evening came out and said that he felt it was a case of when Liz Truss would be replaced, not if. But there is a cynic in me that thinks Michael Gove has only said that now because yesterday, the day before, the polls suggested he'd lose his seat in Surrey Heath. So that's sort of the cynic in me thinks that he's now trying to sort of desperately change the situation because his own head's on the chopping block. And there's been others. So Johnny Mercer was another one who's come out and criticised the Prime Minister, and also Conservative pundits as well. So Andrew Neil's been very critical. There's been lots of criticisms from from lots of parts of the Conservative Party and the sort of we call the Conservative establishment. So it feels like the game's up, right? And I think particularly yesterday, the day before, there was a YouGov poll, I think it was yesterday, which showed that 55% of Conservative members now want Liz Truss to leave. So it feels like the game is up, and I think it now is a case of when rather than if. What are your thoughts on that?
To be down with the kids and use a TikTok phrase, it's not looking good, bruv. It's not looking good. The bookies have got to go in before Christmas. I would agree with that. Most of the pundits that I would trust in this situation, and I know that it's a lot to do with politics, but I very, very much trust Andrew Marr as a political pundit, not only because I grew up with his political punditry, but because I think that Andrew Marr has this wonderful ability, a lot like Robin Day used to in the 70s and 80s, to sit exactly in the middle. He's what I want from a BBC person, right? He's exactly in the middle. He criticises both sides equally. And to hear him on LBC the other day saying, we're not looking at weeks, we might even be looking at days. And you know, Michael Gove has come out and said something very similar. You know my feelings about Michael Gove. I've been very vocal about my feelings on this podcast about Michael Gove. Hate his guts, but think he's very politically astute. And even he has come out and said, yeah, it's over. So I think that there's only so much undermining that you can have as a prime minister. Actually, when you think about it, it is typically very little. And I think that the Conservatives will be wanting to find a candidate as soon as possible because we have a general election in 2 years, and they need to build that base, because you can't just go into a general election with a brand new leader. Because as right or wrong as it is in this system, we have become far more presidential in the way that we look at elections in the United Kingdom, even though in the UK, again, for our international listeners, when you vote in a general election, you do not vote for the Prime Minister unless the Prime Minister is in your seat. Running for your seat. You vote for your local MP, and we do it on whoever gets past that post to form a government first, forms a government. So that's how we work in the UK. You don't vote for the Prime Minister. However, people do. People will vote based on the leader of that party and whether they like them, whether they like the narrative that's being pushed by that party at that moment in time. She has no narrative. She has no mandate. She doesn't even have the support of her members. They cannot take her into a general election. However, I will say the future of Liz Truss, it's going to be very, very interesting for the future of the Conservative Party. They have tried to use Liz Truss as a way of shifting away from Boris Johnson. The people that supported Boris Johnson are now coming out on Twitter, slowly but surely they're coming out of the woodwork saying, oh, it seems a bit silly to sack him for having a slice of cake now. Oh, this never happened under Boris. So you can see that they're vying for their side to be heard. However, what I think this has highlighted with Liz Truss doing what she's done and with Jeremy Hunt being put into that position is the Conservative MPs realise that they need to find a unity candidate, a candidate that can unite both the parliamentary party, their actual wider political membership party, but also that can act as a unifying figure for the nation, because that's what Labour have got in Keir Starmer. And they're looking at it and going, we need one of those. And they need it now so that they can trudge through all of the rubbish. So Keir Starmer's had to do a lot of stuff in the Labour Party to get the Labour Party to the position that we're at now, right? He's had to turn a lot around, and he's needed the last 2 years to do that. So it's a process, and the Conservatives are behind. So I don't think she'll last until Christmas, because they need to pull their finger out if they're going to have any chance of even having a look in 2025.
Yeah, I think the polls do, like, I think another week of these polls, and I think it will really start to, the pressure will really start to turn up. She'll be gone by Christmas, and I'll put money on it. I think the question, of course, then rises. I mean, you talk about, the Conservative unity candidate, and electorally that makes sense. But I think ideally, lots of Conservatives will hope they can just very clearly they won't want a leadership race. They won't want another, as we saw in the summer, another 2 months of Tories punching each other and attacking each other and criticising each other.
May appointment.
Yeah, but the issue with that is, I think there seems to be so much division amongst Conservative MPs at the moment that I question whether or not they would. I mean, maybe they'll get their act together when it comes down to it, but it just feels like there's so much division, and we'll talk about Johnson in a minute a bit more. But I just think that I guess what would happen is you would need Graham Brady to step in and basically say, look, we need 200 MPs to decide on one candidate, and that's it. Graham Brady would have to basically strong arm the process.
But the issue that you have, Adam, and this was my question to you, is who is the candidate? Because I can't see any clear unity candidate in the Conservative Party that has not already nailed their colours to some form of mast?
I think there's two that come to mind straight away. The first one is Ben Wallace. I think partly because, though the question, of course, is whether or not Ben Wallace wants it, and I think there's a genuine question as to whether or not he wants to be Prime Minister. Though maybe that's what the Conservatives need. Maybe they need someone who's a bit more humble, who actually will listen to people. Maybe ideally, you might be the hero they deserve, but not the one they need, or whatever the Batman quote was. Yeah, and the other one, I guess, who I think would definitely want it, I think might be Penny Mordaunt, because she does have this way of, I think she can both appeal to sort of, the more Brexiteer sort of part of the party, and I think she also has a way of appealing to the more sort of, I guess you could say, traditional Conservative part of the party. But I mean, obviously she has, clearly she won't, be completely clear of critics. I don't think any MP would, as you say. But I think those are the two, I guess you'd say, best shots the Conservative Party probably have. But I just think it's difficult, right? Like I'm struggling, as you say, I'm sort of struggling to think of anyone who's perfect. But those, I guess, would be my two suggestions.
I'd agree with that. I think that's quite an astute analysis, although I don't think Ben Wallace would want it. I think you're right in that. I think he's very content in the position that he's in, and I think he thinks he's doing a good job, and I think the country thinks he's doing a pretty good job as well. Penny Mordaunt, I don't know. I mean, her performance in Parliament the other day was absolutely shocking. So
she's not under a table, I promise.
She's not under a table. It's like, dude, it was a joke question. The fact that you had to answer that, Jesus. But yeah, so yeah.
Could it be, just going full House of Cards here, the British version, of course? Could it be someone like? Could it be so? Yeah, the far superior version, which didn't have controversy because of Kevin Spacey. Could it be a sort of Sir Graham Brady? Could it be someone just completely out of the blue, someone like that who comes in and? Could it just be someone completely random who we aren't expecting?
Like we had Margaret Hodge for a short period while our elections and stuff were going on, and it was sort of here we go. She's very sort of, let's put her in the position now. She's very safe hands, very uncontroversial. She just does everything by the party line. Yeah. I
mean, to use a football analogy, it'd be a sort of caretaker manager, I guess. I mean, also, part of the thing I think also is, and this was a question actually raised by Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell in their very interesting podcast.
I genuinely think, podcast, by the way,
it is a podcast. It is brilliant.
Rory Stewart, which they never will, and Alistair Campbell ever listen to this. It's a fantastic podcast. Oh,
it is. It's
We're
amazing.
Both big fans.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think there is a genuine question: are Conservatives now in a position where they even want to form the next government after 2024? Because I get the impression many Conservatives might genuinely, well, first of all, I think there's lots of Conservatives who are just ready to go, just want to, they've had they're so tired of this, they just want to leave, they just want to get out of politics and, get a cushy job as an political analyst at the BBC or somewhere like that, or ITV or Channel 4 or whatever.
I agree. And I think you should look at the cycles of government, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Cycles of government that we have in the United Kingdom. You have long periods of Conservative government followed by Labour governments. We have long periods of both governments. So typically in the UK, let's talk post-war, right? So you had the Conservatives, it was like a coalition government throughout the war. 45, we have an election, Labour are elected, they hold, then it's Conservative for quite a long time. And then the Conservatives colossally mess up in 60, 63, 64, Labour for two governments. It's very sort of, the UK political system isn't very contrary to chop and change that much. You very rarely get sort of 5 block periods, but when you do get a 5-year block period, it's typically the Labour Party that holds that to give the Conservative government a break.
Callaghan Wilson,
yeah. Wilson and Heath, the way that they swapped and changed in 70 and 74 is rare, right? That doesn't typically happen. So I think that the UK system of government, I think that after a certain amount of time, the party in power just gets tired, right? And it becomes really hard when you've been in power for over 10 years to come up with any sort of fresh policy ideas, because I think you just can't see the wood from the trees. And I think that both parties are guilty of this. I will say that in 2010, the Labour Party's manifesto and the Labour Party, it was tired. We've been in government for a very long time. So I think that there is a benefit of switching, But the only thing that I don't like is how we switch, and it seems to last for like 10 years until we switch again. I would rather it be 5, but I think that there's total credibility to that. When you look at the political history of the United Kingdom, you will have a long period of Conservative government, and then you'll get a Labour government for a long period, and then it will switch again. So, yeah. And I just think that the Conservatives have ran down the clock now, which is why they're all fighting with each other.
I also think I think there also is a feeling, I think, that the Conservatives almost want to go into opposition so they can find out who they are. They need to go on a sort of, for the party to survive in the long term, they need to go on a soul-searching mission. They need to go into opposition and effectively fight it out between these factions, which seem to be more divided than ever, and try to sort of, almost kind of how they became consensus after sort of the Blairite period, the Blair and Brown period. They need to, I think many of their party now believe they just need to have a bit of time in opposition where they can effectively sort themselves out, basically.
Completely agreed. Exactly as Labour did in the 50s to get to where we were in the 60s, as Labour did in the 80s to get to where we were in the 90s. You sometimes need that period to look at yourselves and go, who are we? What do we actually want? And I think that it would do the Conservatives really well, especially jumping onto the point that we talked about earlier when it comes to the national narrative. They are so disconnected from the national narrative at the moment because they have been in power for too long. That's it.
Yeah, I think just my final point on the UK, because I want to address it before we talk about the US, because I'm looking at time. There's just so much to talk about, right? So a couple of days ago, Nadine Dorries tweeted the possibility of Boris Johnson making a comeback if Liz Truss goes, and this was also supported by a former MEP as well on, I think it was Good Morning Britain. And there's been a couple of other, as you said earlier, we're starting to hear whisperings of a possibility of Johnson coming back. And my immediate, before I turn over to you, Katie, my first thoughts on this are, so in the summer, Dominic Cummings, who I'm sure you will remember, was the former advisor of Boris Johnson and also a big sort of figure in the Brexit campaign, or effectively ran the Brexit campaign. He claimed over the summer that Boris Johnson wanted Liz Truss to win so that she would eventually implode and that he would be able to walk back into office. And I think there is actually obviously we can't know if that's true for certain, but I think there is some credibility to that theory. I think it is a reasonably plausible theory. I think the only issue is, I think even Boris Johnson has underestimated just how quickly Liz Truss would implode. I think he probably saw it in time frame. He probably thought, she'll survive until the locals next May, sort of May 2023, possibly into the autumn, and I can make a return sort of late 2023, possibly early 2024, because hopefully by then all the Conservatives who turned on me and kicked me out would have sort of forgiven me or be so desperate at that point they'll want me back. So I think, thankfully, from my perspective, because I don't want him back as Prime Minister for obvious reasons, I think it's too early. So I can't see this comeback happening. Then again, could it happen in a couple of years when they're outside of government? Possibly, but I think now is too early. What do you think, Katie?
I think it's too early, and I think that the way that they are approaching it already is totally incorrect, because they're basically spinning lies. So, as I said earlier, some Conservative individual supporters, notable Conservative supporters, let's call them, it seems a bit silly to sack him for eating a piece of cake. That's not why Boris Johnson was sacked. And we need to put that out there immediately. And I know that Labour and the Liberals will do this. And the SNP as well. Boris Johnson was removed by the MPs because he lied, and he was a compulsive liar. He lied to the cabinet, he lied to Parliament, he lied to various people, he lied to the Queen, for goodness sake, but he was removed because he lied about prior knowledge of an individual's sexual assault allegations before placing him in a considerable position of power within the Conservative Party, where he knew he would have access to vulnerable adults and vulnerable people. So he lied, and it actually formed a safeguarding issue. That's why Boris Johnson was got rid of. It was not over cake. He actually survived the cake. And to be honest with you, if it was just about the cake, I could see why you'd want to bring him back. However, it was not just about that. It was a very, very serious allegation as to why he was got rid of by the Conservative Party. So I think that the way that they are positioning it now is all wrong. And I don't think it's going to get them anywhere when it comes to actually bringing him back. But I do think that they are going to try.
I think I agree with that. I think thank you for pointing that out. Actually, that's a really
No
crucial.
problem. I just
It's such an
really want to
important.
make
No,
sure
it is such an important point to raise. Yeah. So I think let's talk about very quickly why this has come up. I think as part of the YouGov poll that I mentioned, which showed that 55% of Conservative members now want Liz Truss gone. That same poll, when asking who their preferred next prime minister would be, the highest support came for Boris Johnson. So it appears there's still support within the membership for Boris Johnson. But I think I would argue that just shows how out of touch a lot of the Conservative Party membership is. Not all of it, but lots of it.
And it's a very small membership pool, let's be honest.
We're not
talking like the membership of the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party.
Not, and it's so should point out this is Tory members, not Tory supporters as well, which I think is another important point. Yeah, so I think what this shows is there's clearly some feeling within the party they can bring Boris back, but as you say, I think it's just electorally unpalatable. And frankly, I don't want to give it any more oxygen because it's horrible to think about.
We should not think about it. We should not give it credence. And whenever we see it, we should challenge it because it's absolutely irresponsible.
Absolutely. So as I'm keeping an eye on time, let's go across the Atlantic to America. And of course, the big news is that the committee, which is looking at the January 6th insurgency, riot, whatever you want to call it, has subpoenaed Donald Trump. So Katie, over to you.
Ta-da! This is my speciality. I've been very looking forward to talking about this. So just a quick recap, what was the January 6th insurgency? Because as Adam said, it's been quite a while ago now. So just a quick recap, the January 6th insurgency, essentially, after Joe Biden legally and truthfully won the 2020 election, we all watched it on television, so it happened. Donald Trump decided to call a rally of sorts in front of the White House, in front of, in Washington. All of the Proud Boys were there, all of these alt-right groups, QAnon, heavy presence, etc. All of Trump's sort of die-hard boot boys, really, is what I would call them. The people that go to places and cause trouble and bully people in the far right, they were all there. And Donald Trump took it upon himself with other members of Congress as well. Let's not pin it all on Trump, because it wasn't all Trump. I think that he was a bigger influence in it, but I think that people like Matt Gaetz, Lindsey Graham, etc., they were all stoking the flames, Marjorie Taylor Greene. So they all gave speeches. And basically, at the end of Trump's speech, he basically incited this crowd of yobs, as we would call them in Britain, to go up to the Capitol and go and stop the count, go and stop the election being ratified, go and reclaim the United States of America for yourselves, right, basically. And he did incite them. So this is a fact of what actually happened. A lot of people are saying, oh, well, he didn't really say. He did. He said, go and march to the Capitol. So they went, they did as he said, because obviously a lot of the things around Donald Trump's leadership are very cult-like. These people will do anything that he tells them to do and believe anything that he tells them to believe. So he told them, go to the Capitol. They went to the Capitol. They started assaulting Capitol police officers. They broke through barricades and they led a full-out assault on the United States Capitol building, which is where their branch of government sits. So it's like Parliament is its UK comparison. It's where the House and the Senate are trying to ratify the United States election and say Joe Biden is the next president of the United States. For that day, there were various appeals that were being held by senators, etc., basically saying that the votes were tampered with, it was an illegal voting system, etc. So in the US, how they ratify their votes, for example, in the UK, we don't have this system. You just count the votes and announce who won. It's really quite simple. In the US, what they do is they count the votes, they say who's won, and then they have to go to the House and basically ratify it and say, this is what's happened, all in favour, say aye, and then they vote it through, right? It's sort of like it's more of like a ceremonial thing, but I think the reason why you can oppose it is why British people look at it and go, it's a bit unnecessary. But anyway, they do it. And the Republicans were basically appealing against every single seat that they believed had been tampered with. So notable things like Georgia, Pennsylvania, I believe Iowa was on there as well. So there's just this whole list of seats that they're saying was tampered with and the votes were not legal. As this is happening, all of the rioters get into the Capitol building. They storm the Capitol. They are armed. They're looking for Mike Pence, Nancy Pelosi. They actually erected gallows outside of the Capitol to kill them. And they're just running riot in the Capitol. So they had to go on full lockdown. The vice president had to be moved to a secure location. The Speaker of the House also had to. And all of this time while this is happening, I remember watching it. It's happening over hours of time. Donald Trump is nowhere to be found. He is sat in the White House watching and just rubbing his hands with glee as to what's going on. Everybody's trying to get Donald Trump to call in the National Guard, because the National Guard, the way that it works is they can come across jurisdictions, but they also need permission to do that. They're sort of like a paramilitary force that's just above the police and just below the army. So they can go across state borders, but because Washington, D.C. is like its own little bubble, Virginia need permission to go in. All of the border states need permission to come into D.C. to assist. Nobody would give that authorization. In footage that we saw the other day, Nancy Pelosi couldn't give that authorization. She was trying to. The mayor of Washington, D.C. was trying to give that authorization. The president and the defense secretary needed to give that authorization. It needed to be them, right? So none of this is happening. People are attacking. And then essentially what happened was Donald Trump unwillingly went on a live stream and basically said, we're all very proud of you. We love you very much, but you've got to go home because you've upset people now. And then withdrew them all back. In this time, Capitol Police officers were seriously injured. Some of them have since sadly committed suicide because of the PTSD that occurred on that day. A Trump supporter was shot by a Capitol Police officer because she was breaching, and she was actually, you know, it's very illegal what they did. Simply breaking into the Capitol building is very illegal. So that's January 6th. That's what happened. Massive insurgency, massive threat to the democracy of the United States, and an attempt by the people of the United States, a small group of the United States, to form a coup against the United States government. That's what it was. Let's put no bones about it. It was a president trying to instigate a coup to hold power when he had democratically lost power. That's what it was. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly accurate summation. I think it was definitely a moment in which, I mean, people say, you know, talk about significant moments where things fundamentally change. It felt like a moment where things just fundamentally changed in American democracy. It felt like American democracy would never be the same again. This felt like like you're talking about, you know, up there with sort of, I think probably since, in terms of political importance, probably the most important moment since probably 9/11, if I'm being honest. I mean, it was so fun. And I think the thing that particularly irritates me is the fact that a lot of Republicans seem to be now trying to basically rewrite history and downplay it. It's kind of like, oh, it was just a few people who had a few too many drinks and were just being silly. It clearly wasn't that. It was clearly very menacing and very much, you know, had a menacing intent to it. And I think that's something which we should always remember and always emphasize.
So I agree. I think the thing that we need to look at with this is, the main thing that we need to look at is with intent, right? Everything that they did was with intent to destabilize American democracy and to threaten the United States government. So, you know, like you said, it was a big moment. I remember sat watching it like, Jesus Christ, if democracy doesn't work in America, the West is like screwed, because this is like our beacon of democracy, and it's just not. It's not defending itself. And what we found out in this moment, it really did highlight in a way that I think a lot of political commentators and people like you and me had seen previously throughout the Trump years, the continual undermining of American democracy and the continual inability of the system to protect itself, because it basically worked on a system of sort of, we call it like the old boys agreement, you know, right? Where it's like, you do it because that's what you do. So there's no actual checks and balances and consequences in place for if you don't follow the rules, because the founding fathers couldn't comprehend that people would not follow the rules. right? So it was a system that was under immediate threat and was unable to protect itself. And that was the most scary thing, because that was actually a physical manifestation of the last 4 years, and it was just awful. So in response to that, there was the January 6th hearings, okay, where basically they set up a committee. And the committee heard testimony from people that were there on the day. They've heard testimony from people that were inside the White House. There has been testimony from Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner. All of the Trump family pretty much have been approached for testimony. Testimony from Secret Service agents, from senators, from representatives that were in government on that day. We've heard from Capitol Police officers. We've heard from the families of Capitol Police officers, as I said, that sadly have lost their lives since the insurgency because of the PTSD that they suffered. It's terrible. And there's been over 1 million documents and forms of evidence that have been examined by this committee. And yeah, what they have effectively done is they have approached it in a way that I think is really, really good. They got the assistance of a legal team at the start, and they've approached it like a legal case. They have approached it, let's have a look at what happened on the day, but also let's have a look at what happened before, leading up to that day, what we knew about it beforehand, who was told about it beforehand, how it came to be, why it came to be. Let's look at then what happened on the day, how it transpired, who were the main players on the day, who were the people that were blocking assistance to the Capitol, who were the people that were trying to help the Capitol, what was the narrative of the protesters on that day that made them then push to form an insurgency, but then also what happened after it, and why was that narrative continued, and why is it now being continued, you know? And I think that it's a really good way of looking at it. The hearing has had people from both sides of the political argument in the United States. Very important to say, there are both Democrats and Republicans. Liz Cheney is a notable Republican who has had a lot of fallout from being on this committee, but has done, in my opinion, an absolutely stellar job at just presenting what has happened. And essentially, that is what the committee has done. They've basically said to the American public, here is what happened on January 6th. So the committee is coming towards the end of its hearings, and as its big final move, which has been floating around for ages, people saying you should just call him, the committee subpoenaed Donald Trump. Now, a subpoena, for those of you that don't know, is like a legal, I'm not a lawyer, so this is going to be like a layman's term. It's like a legal requirement for you to go and testify before a committee, before a jury, right, basically. So that's where it usually is. When you get subpoenaed to a trial, you have to go and give testimony. Now, Donald Trump has responded to this subpoena with a 14-page rant. You can read it if you want to. I really don't recommend it. Of him basically saying all of the stuff that the January 6th committee has shown to be not true, and all of the stuff that his own Department of Justice, the DOJ, and his own Attorney General has shown to be false. He's basically said, oh, the election was rigged, it was stolen, and all of this crap, right? That's what he's spouting now. But he hasn't said whether he will or won't attend the committee hearing. So that's where we're at the moment. He's been subpoenaed to go and give testimony because he's the only one that they haven't been able to question. They have questioned everyone else, including the Secret Service. But the reason that I think that they want to question Donald Trump, not because it's a big political move, let's be honest, because he's posturing to run again in the next presidential election, but it's because we actually have a very serious case of an allegation of the Secret Service lying to the January 6th committee to protect Donald Trump, which is a huge, huge issue, because it would show that the Secret Service has been infiltrated.
I mean, thank you for that explanation. I've got so many questions on the back of that.
That's
so
where we're at.
So first of all, I guess my first question is: Does Trump actually need to turn up? Does he have a legal requirement to turn up, or could he just sort of just say no? Like, what is the position on that?
Truthfully, I'm not sure. I have been trying to keep up with a lot of the journalism. I've been watching MSNBC, CNN, etc., and I haven't seen a response to that question yet. I don't know. One of the things that I do know is this January 6th committee hearing holds no ability to prosecute. Because it is a government committee, it is not the Department of Justice. All that they can do is recommend that the Department of Justice open a case on this, which is why they've done it the way that they've done it, in my opinion, which is very, very clever. It's to show the American people and the DOJ, here's all of the evidence that we've got. And I think the reason that they are subpoenaing him now is basically to let him just come in and to perjure himself, to spin a load of rubbish, and then when the DOJ pulls him in, he's going to perjure himself.
I mean, that's the thing, right? So let's say hypothetically he does go to this committee.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a lawyer, but I suspect from what I know that his lawyers would probably advise him
not to.
Well, first of all, if you can not turn up, don't turn up, and if you have to go,
plead the fifth.
Plead the fifth. Don't say anything. But just knowing the sort of person that Trump is, I just don't think he'd be able to resist the temptation to basically run his mouth off and sort of scream at people, shout at people.
That he sent is a really good example that his lawyers have no control over him.
Yeah, so I think it would be fascinating. I think I suspect it would probably be
go, and I think he will go for his own ego. Because let's be honest, he's not been in the political narrative for a long time, Adam. This is a nice bit of for him.
I think it would also. I think it's fair to say it'd probably be the most watched Congress committee.
Oh yeah, we shit.
It would become the most watched Congress committee questioning of probably ever. I think it would definitely. It would be huge, and I think obviously all we can do is watch the space and see what happens. I think obviously looking at the broader point, I'm curious: will this have much of an impact on the midterms? Will this have much of an impact on the presidential election in 2024? Obviously, these are the sort of the big questions. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
The midterms, we have a couple of weeks left. Well, about 3 weeks, I think. It's November 8th, the midterms are. And I'm not one in politics because I'm a cynic because of the generation that I was raised in, to say that it's a done deal. But I think something pretty catastrophic would have to happen to Joe Biden and the Democrats at this point to turn the narrative in a way that would be catastrophic to them. I think the polls that we're seeing at this moment in time are so ridiculously not typical. So just to put it into some context, typically in the midterms, the president usually suffers losses. It's very, very, very common for the party that the president represents, so in this case, the Democrats, to lose seats and to lose control of the other branch of government. Okay, so of the Senate, and that it's normal for that to happen. But what we're seeing at the moment is that the Democrats are actually doing incredibly well, and one of the reasons that they are doing incredibly well is because of the January 6th committee, is because of the work that the January 6th committee has done to prove that there were instances of illegality happening on that day and that they were being orchestrated not only by Donald Trump, but by lead members of the Republican Party. So they've kind of tarred them all with the same brush. In my opinion, with Donald Trump's subpoena, I think it can only go to further the Democratic vote, because I think the damage has already been done. They've already produced over 1 million pieces of evidence, for goodness sake, to show that this was an orchestrated effort. I think that the Donald Trump thing is just to seal the deal and to say to the DOJ, here's your statements on record that he's made, go with them. That's what I think it is. I don't think it's going to be the Democrats. I think it's only the Republicans.
I must admit, I'm still worried about the midterms because I'm seeing. Well, I think the problem is different people say different things, particularly in US politics. It's such a polarized thing. It's hard to know who to believe.
And one of the things that I would say is don't get too wrapped up in the Trump mania of he can still draw in crowds of people in Arizona. He can still draw in crowds of people in et cetera, et cetera. we have had these people that are drawn into crowds that are, you know, sort of Republican Party holders that would go, you know, that can vote in selecting the candidate, etc. Very different when you put that candidate out onto a stage. And one of the things that I would say that is giving me faith is Beto in Texas. He's doing absolutely great. Beto O'Rourke is. He's doing fantastic. There are people posting pictures of their neighborhoods in 2020 with all the Trump posters out who now have Beto posters out. So there's a lot going on, and you've got to look at it from a multi-pronged approach. And I think that that's the way that the Democrats have moved forward, and the effective method that they're doing right now is they're not just going on, we're not Trump and we're not the Republicans. They're going on, do you want healthcare? Do you want your student loans being wiped? Do you want more progressive policy when it comes to climate change? And people really, they are not as controversial points as people think that they are. In the United States, the Republicans often politicize those points, but the Democrats are kind of using it as a form of common sense of, well, come on, guys, look, don't you want all of these things? And it seems to be working.
Yeah, so I'm noticed we have talked for a long time, and I think it's just because, again, there's so much to talk about. We could talk about, but I do want to sort of wrap it up with one final question. Is Governor DeSantis, the Florida governor, currently rubbing his hands? Because it does look like if this goes the way it could go, it looks like he might very much become the front runner for 2024.
Yes, he is. And the final thing that I wanted to talk about were the impacts of, you know, what this has had and what Trump's sort of reign of terror has had on the United States, and the impacts that we're still seeing today of the downflow. The impacts that we've had from January 6th and from the electoral fraud allegations that spurred it on are we've had massive appeals by Republican senators in southern states, especially trying to fill the seats in their local legislature, etc., that are responsible for voting and for conducting the elections. That's led to even stricter voter laws in certain states, which are, Georgia is the main one, which are all, and I will put my neck on the line here and say they are all racially motivated. They are all racist. They are all to disengage and to exclude certain areas of the demographic from voting. That's all they do, by introducing voter ID laws, by introducing stricter voter registration laws, by introducing laws which require individuals to go to city halls, etc., or even in some cases, local police departments, etc., to register to vote. It is all to discourage people from registering to vote, especially Hispanic people, people from the Latino community, African Americans, Black people, people of color. It is to discourage them from going to register to vote and from carrying out their right as a member of as a person of the United States to vote. Okay, that's all it is. It's voter intimidation. And they're doing it because these are the states that are experiencing a certain backlash and a movement towards Democrat voting. When these people turn out, they vote blue, and they don't like it. The Republicans don't. So speaking onto that, that's one of the big impacts of this, of the voter thing. And another big impact is, as you said, Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is now rubbing his hands with glee, because when Trump comes to the subpoena, I'm saying when, because I think it's going to be too much for him to just, I don't think he can resist, right? I think he just wants to go there because he's had a lot of things happen to him over the summer. And I think this is his sort of opportunity to get it all off of his chest, you know, and have a bit of a rant. So when he goes, and he obviously makes an absolute tit of himself, which he's going to, and basically provides the DOJ with all of the evidence that they need to push forward with the trial, and then to get him on the record and get him to perjure himself, which he will do because he's fundamentally, Donald Trump is stupid. Let's just put that out there. Fundamentally, Donald Trump is a stupid person, so he will do it. It gives Ron DeSantis more credence for his cause, more ability to say, I am the safe pair of hands. I am the classic Republican. Donald Trump is just somebody who is an idealist. He's somebody who's, you know, peeing in the wind. I'm the guy to get it done. I can do this because I've done it in Florida. So I think that this is, even if we don't get Trump, we're still in big doo-doo in 2024, because Joe Biden cannot and will not run against Ron DeSantis very well. We will need a different candidate, because Biden, he just hasn't got it in him. to go against
that,
somebody like Ron DeSantis.
We could talk. I think we could easily do another episode on just.
We could do another episode on that close time, but yeah,
all the stuff, all the stuff he's done with sending migrants to democratic states and things like that, and
again, another impact of the power that the Republican Party feel like they have, and they've been emboldened by the January 6th insurgency. So I think that, you know, watch it. For goodness sake, please watch the hearings. If or when, like I said, when, in my opinion, Trump goes before the January 6th committee, please watch it, and watch how Merrick Garland, who is the Attorney General of the United States, and the DOJ, the Department of Justice, how they respond. Because I really do think Donald Trump will not be able to run for president of the United States in 2024, because I genuinely think he will have a criminal conviction against him.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be fascinating. It'll be truly fascinating. And also,
if they don't, then I'm going to be very disappointed in the Democratic Party, because they've got so much dirt on him now. They just need to pin him down.
I mean, yeah, it will be fascinating. I think definitely we'll have to try and do something together and watch it if he does, because I mean that would just be, I want to watch that. I think everyone, lots of film just want to watch it. It'll just be fascinating.
Most of the known world will want to watch it, because it's just going to be like a fascinating sort of.
I mean, who knows what would happen? I mean,
God knows. Going to say.
Anyway, it would just be fascinating. Anyway, so I think that's a good place to stop.
And sorry for ranting. I feel like I'm ranting
it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly
very
fine.
Important that people know what's happening.
Thank you for informing us, because, as I said, I must admit my knowledge of focus on US politics has been very poor recently, particularly the last sort of year or two. It's just
pick it up, because it's getting good again.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, and also it goes without saying, the US is quite an important country for the West and for the planet.
Very important.
Yeah. So thank you so much for watching. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll be back, of course, next week. Who knows what we'll be talking about? Possibly a new prime minister. Possibly, oh god, who knows? You have to just wait and see. All right, thank you so much for watching, and bye.
Take care. Bye.